Off during violent demonstrations in Melbourne. While Victorians are warned not to expect restrictions to be lifted quickly after 76 new COVID-19 cases and 11 deaths are reported overnight.
As frustrating, as challenging as it is, we need to stay the course on this so that we can be sure that the settings we lock in can be defended.
Also ahead, President Trump fires back at allegations he insulted fallen US soldiers. And fresh produce poised for a supermarket price hike as international border restrictions hamper harvesting efforts. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Miriam Korowa. Victoria's Chief Health Officer says the state is on the way to defeating the second wave of coronavirus as new infections slowly and steadily decline. But there are concerns all the hard work could be brought undone as people have gathered to protest stage for lockdown restrictions. Elias Clure is there.
There's still a significant police presence here at Albert Park Lake, but most of them have packed up after the crowd of about 300 anti-lockdown protesters dispersed. Now, the protesters started at the Shrine of Remembrance, where we saw a number of arrests, and drifted towards the lake, where they marched chanting freedom. They also hurled abuse at police officers and the media. In fact, we saw riot police try to form a wall between the protesters, but they had to retreat because they were receiving so much vitriol from these anti-lockdown demonstrators. Now, the Premier, Daniel Andrews, has described these protesters as selfish and described their actions as ruining it for everyone. He says it's particularly disappointing given Victoria is heading in the right direction when it comes to its daily case numbers.
It is not safe, it is not smart, it is not lawful. In fact, it is absolutely selfish for people to be out there protesting. The only protest we should be engaged in, the only argument, the only fight we should be engaged in is against this virus.
The Premier will be hoping that we don't see any more protests like we saw today as we approach the roadmap out of lockdown, which will be announced tomorrow morning.
The demonstrations come as Victoria records 76 new cases of coronavirus and 11 deaths, 10 of those linked to aged care. Premier Daniel Andrews says despite the downward trend of infections, it's still too much of a risk to reopen everything. Stephen Schubert has the latest from Melbourne.
That number of 76 new coronavirus cases in Victoria is down a little bit on the last couple of days. It was 81 yesterday and 113 the day before that. The all-important 7-day average, which is the trend line, is also down, but only by 3 from yesterday. It's sitting at 88. But if you compare it to what it was last Saturday at 134, that's still heading in the right direction. Unfortunately, 11 more deaths also recorded in Victoria. That takes the total in the state for this pandemic to 661.
Now, Stephen, we've also had several people being charged over alleged breaches overnight. What can you tell us there?
Well, just this morning, there's been a number of people arrested in Melbourne CBD who were attending a protest against the lockdown. This comes after 4 organisers were charged with incitement, and the Premier, Daniel Andrews, has described this protest as illegal and selfish. We also know that one man has been charged with attempted bribery after trying to cross the Murray River into New South Wales at Barmer, which is just upstream from Echuca. He didn't have a permit to offer police when he was stopped and checked, but he did offer $1,000 in an envelope, and police didn't appreciate that. We also have seen 6 people who took a luxury yacht to Queensland last month and stopped at a number of ports along the New South Wales coast on the way, charged with, fined a total of $9,000. So plenty of people still doing the wrong thing when it comes to these restrictions, Miriam.
Now, Stephen, of course, everyone is waiting to hear from the Premier again tomorrow with the announcement around the roadmap out of lockdown. What are we anticipating?
all eyes will be on Daniel Andrews tomorrow. We know that there will be two separate plans, one for regional Victoria, one for Melbourne. And the number of cases in regional Victoria is only down to 102 active cases now, and that's well down from a couple of weeks ago. And we have seen local government areas that are under stage 3 restrictions that have never had an active case of coronavirus, or who haven't had an active one for weeks or months. What it does seem, though, listening to the Premier today, is that for Melbourne, we won't be seeing those restrictions lifted dramatically anytime soon. Let's have a listen to what Daniel Andrews said just a short time ago.
No one is really advocating to open and be open for just a few weeks. And if you opened at these levels, that is exactly what would happen. It would be 5 minutes of sunshine and then a third wave that arguably will be even more devastating than the second. We just have to find a way to be as steadfast as this virus. It is stubborn. The tail of the second wave is a stubborn thing, and we are seeing these numbers come down.
We don't know exactly when the Premier will be outlining this roadmap tomorrow, but we do know it won't clash with the afternoon footy, Miriam.
And the ABC will have special coverage of the Victorian Government's roadmap out of lockdown announcement. That's tomorrow morning from 8 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on the ABC's News channel. While much of the focus is on Melbourne, there are protests in other parts of the country, including WA and South Australia. In Perth, hundreds gathered outside State Parliament to protest lockdown measures in Western Australia. Attendees at the Perth Freedom March say they're standing in solidarity with protesters in Victoria, who claim their rights are being compromised by the coronavirus restrictions. New South Wales has recorded 5 new cases of coronavirus. One of the new cases is a returned traveller in hotel quarantine, while the other 4 cases are all locally acquired and linked to the Sydney CBD cluster. Another new case recorded outside the testing timeframe will be included in tomorrow's official figures. That infection is in an emergency department staff member who worked 2 shifts at Concord and Liverpool Hospital. How they became infected is still under investigation. Liquor and Gaming New South Wales has named Bondi Bowling Club as the state's worst venue to date for breaches of COVID-19 restrictions. Inspectors say there were multiple group bookings of over 10 people, no social distancing in bar queues, inadequate sign-in processes and staff not enforcing mandatory measures. The venue has been hit with a double fine totalling $10,000. Queensland has recorded 1 new case of coronavirus overnight. The Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk says the new case is a close contact of a known infection. It takes the state's total number of cases to 1,129, with 26 considered active. Queensland Deputy Premier Stephen Marshall says authorities are issuing an alert for a ferry the woman travelled on while potentially infectious.
We have been concerned throughout the pandemic about the southern Moreton Bay Islands. People on those islands, they are vulnerable and they often have difficulty accessing health services. And so we wanted to get a message out very quickly to people on those islands or who have travelled on the Russell Island ferry to monitor their health very, very closely.
The Queensland Deputy Premier is, of course, Stephen Miles. Well, the former Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, Dr Joe Williams, has passed away from COVID-19 in Auckland. Dr Williams briefly led the Pacific Nation in 1999 and also served as the Minister for Health and Education. The 85-year-old was one of 2 new deaths recorded in New Zealand in the past 24 hours. There have also been 3 new infections. 1 case is a returned traveller and the other 2 are community transmissions linked to the Auckland cluster. Labor has accused members of the government of trying to bully state leaders into reopening their borders. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says he respects Western Australia's decision not to agree with the goal set by other states and territories to reopen by Christmas. But coalition backbencher Andrew Laming has criticised the WA Premier, saying the hard border is, in his words, bizarre and politically motivated. Labor's Chris Bowen says his comments are out of line.
They are trying to bully premiers. Well, premiers are doing the right thing. And Premiers should not have to put up with the likes of Andrew Laming today, who launched an outrageous political attack on Mark McGowan, who's doing his job.
Police are investigating a suspected murder-suicide involving a toddler in far north Queensland. Reporter Marion Farr is at the scene.
The tiny community of Rossville, south of Cooktown, is in shock after the death of a 4-year-old boy and 46-year-old man Troy Harvey. Their bodies were found at this remote property in what police believe is a murder-suicide. It's understood Mr Harvey was the child's father and had been suffering mental health issues at the time. The news has devastated the community, whose population is just over 200.
The whole community is so devastated about it. Even people that were coming in yesterday at the shop, they were just upset, especially with the 4-year-old boy. I just don't understand how things like that happen. I really don't.
A crime scene has been established at the property as police work to determine how the pair died.
Police are continuing to investigate after 2 men were shot, one of them fatally, in Sydney's Inner West yesterday. Initial inquiries suggest the shootings were targeted and the men were known to each other. One of the men died en route to hospital, while the other remains hospitalised in a serious condition with gunshot wounds to his head. An American city in the US state of New York has become the new focus of Black Lives Matter protests following the death of a black man in police custody. Daniel Prude died in March, 7 days after officers in Rochester put a mesh bag over his head to stop him spitting. The city's mayor only announced the suspension of 7 officers on Thursday. More than 100 protesters called on the New York State Attorney General to take swift action. The US President Donald Trump has hit back at reports he privately referred to American soldiers killed in action as, in his words, losers and suckers. An article in The Atlantic magazine claims Mr. Trump made the comments during a visit to an American military cemetery in France 2 years ago, a story which the president says is fake.
It's a hoax, just like the fake dossier was a hoax. Just like the Russia was a hoax. It was a total hoax, no collusion. Just like so many other things, it's a hoax.
If what is written in The Atlantic is true, it's disgusting. And it affirms what most of us believe to be true. That Donald Trump is not fit to be the job of president, to be the commander-in-chief.
Authorities have suspended their search for 41 missing crew who were on board a live export ship thought to have sunk off southwestern Japan. 2 Australians are among the missing, and as a typhoon bears down on the search zone, rescue crews have been forced to postpone their efforts until it passes. North Asia correspondent Jake Sturmer reports from Tokyo.
With every hour and day that passes in this search, the chances of survival decrease. But in some hopeful news late last night, Japan's Coast Guard announced they'd found another survivor, a 30-year-old Filipino sailor. Of the 43 crew members, 2 have now been rescued, both Filipino men, and 1 has died. The unidentified man was pulled from the ocean unconscious and floating face down. He has not been identified at this stage. The Filipino chief officer who was rescued on Wednesday told authorities that one engine had shut down and then a massive wave forced the ship to capsize and it then later sank. The Gulf Livestock One has a checkered past. In July this year, it had engine troubles as well and had to call in the Philippines Navy for help. In May last year, the Australian Maritime Safety Authority detained the ship in Broome after it found serious deficiencies. Some crew hadn't been properly trained in how to use the computer-based navigation system, and they hadn't been updated with the latest navigational hazards. The deficiencies were rectified and the ship travelled to Indonesia safely. Its fate now, though, remains uncertain. Japan's meteorological agency is warning of another typhoon which is tracking towards the search area, bringing torrential rain and strong winds. It's expected to cross the Amami region late on Sunday or early Monday, and waves are expected to reach 8 metres.
Lebanon has observed a minute's silence a month after the devastating Beirut port mega blast that killed about 200 people and injured 6,000 others. The country has been buoyed by possible signs of life in a building that was destroyed by the explosion.
Probing for signs of life deep in the rubble. Hidden from view, sensitive scanning equipment in the hands of a specialist rescue team from Chile. On Thursday morning, they picked up what seemed to be breath sounds. And for 2 days, they've been searching. Painstaking work, much of it done by hand, clawing away at a ruin that could collapse any second. The dust and debris being sucked out to clear a pathway to the second floor, the focus of the search.